Okay, well, I think we can start now. It's good to see such a large number of people, and just really a hello and a very warm welcome to everyone who's joining us here tonight. My name's Ed Bottoms, and I'm Head of Archives here at the AA. And I think we're in for a really fascinating evening, celebrating the launch of Dr. Patrick Zamarian's superb history of the AA in the post-war years. And Patrick will be giving us a talk really for the first section of tonight, followed afterwards, hopefully by a nice lengthy Q&A session. Now, this year really is, of course, the 174th birthday of the AA, and the publication of Patrick's book marks really the centenary of the AA's incorporation, and of course the launch of its 5-year diploma course. Now, over the last decade or so, we've seen a flurry of articles, books, and exhibitions critically examining the pedagogy and the cultural output of the AA in the 1970s and 80s, under the dynamic chairmanship, of course, of Alvin Boyarsky. Yet, surprisingly enough, only a handful of articles and research done by the AA XX100 group have really written about the post-war decades, a period arguably, well, of course, of equal importance. And indeed, this is one of the main reasons, or one of the principal reasons, that makes Patrick's book so special and so important, is that it really is the first which makes full use of our extensive archival collections for these years, thus being able to disentangle for us many of the myths and half-truths which developed so easily at the AA. And what Patrick does in fact reveal is a far more complex and fascinating narrative, which I'm sure you'll all agree. I'm not one for big, long introductions, so before actually introducing Patrick, I should say that the book is on sale online at the AA bookshop at a special launch price for the month of January of £36, which is 20% off the usual retail price. So immediately this finishes, get on there and buy it. And I think a link has been posted in the chat there for you to purchase from. So I want to introduce my friend Patrick, Dr. Patrick Zamarian, who's an architect and historian. He studied at ETH Zurich, followed up by his doctorate at the University of Liverpool, where he now, of course, lectures. And I've known Patrick for a good many years now through his research in the archives, and his diligence and his razor-sharp intelligence and searching. His research skills are just phenomenal, and his writing, you can judge yourself in this book. I cannot recommend it any more highly. So I pass over to you, Patrick.
Well, thanks a lot, Ed. Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for coming. I'm really pleased, of course, to launch my book on the AA here at the AA, or say via the AA. And I'm very grateful to Monica for inviting me. Thanks a lot. I wish I could start my talk by also thanking the many people who helped me in my research for the book. Unfortunately, I can't do this because if I tried, I'd still be here tomorrow morning. I must mention a small number of people, though, and no one more so than you, Ed. I could not have written this book without your help and generosity. So thank you very much indeed. I'm also grateful to my patient editors at Lund Humphreys and to Barnabas Calder and Mark Swennerton, to whom I owe a particularly great debt. Now, the AA, it is often said, is impenetrable to the uninitiated, and there's probably some truth in this. But I must say that my own experience as a complete outsider researching the AA was a completely different one. I experienced nothing but goodwill and support from the moment I first set foot in Bedford Square, both from the people who worked there, but also from the wider membership. In the course of my research, I contacted countless former staff and students, many of them in their 80s and 90s, and only one of them ever rejected my advance, and he was terribly sorry about it. So if nothing else, the AA really does have a fabulous cast of character. I'm now sharing my screen with you, and I will assume that you can see that screen unless I hear otherwise. Monographs about architectural schools are few and far between, and frankly, there aren't many schools that deserve one, but the AA most certainly does. It is often assumed that the AA owes its global reputation to the chairmanship of Alvin Boyarsky in the 1970s and 1980s, but the AA was a school of international standing long before he arrived. In the immediate post-war years, continental architects looked with envy to the AA, which they saw, and I quote one of them, as Europe's most advanced school of architecture. In Britain itself, the AA had long been in competition with Liverpool and the Bartlett, but after the Second World War, it emerged without rival. In my estimate, the AA, which was one of more than 20 fully validated schools in the country, produced about half of its leading architects. I will save you the name dropping, which again will keep us here until tomorrow morning. Now, my book tells the story of the AA. And because the AA was such an important breeding ground for talent and trends, it also tells a story of British architecture more broadly. Now, 40 minutes is rather too short to summarize 4 years of research, so allow me to skip all this and give you my conclusions instead, or at least some of them. The book covers the entire history of the AA up until the late 1980s, seen in its broader educational, social, political, economic context. But the emphasis is, as the title suggests, on the 2 or 3 decades following the end of the Second World War. Now, I will limit my remarks today to this particular period. And rather than summarizing the various chapters of my book, I will, you will be pleased to hear, focus entirely on student work. Inevitably, and this will only scratch the surface of what is an incredibly rich and complex story. But on the other hand, when all is said and done, student work is what really matters in a school of architecture. So what I will try today is to highlight 3 main themes which preoccupied AA students in the post-war period. However, before I get to that, allow me to set the scene and give you a sketch of the broader shifts that occurred in the post-war years and introduce the main characters, namely the 4 principals who headed the AA in this period. Immediately after the war, the person in charge was Gordon Brown, an unjustly forgotten figure in the AA's history. This was an incredibly difficult time for architecture schools, all of them overcrowded and struggling with dilapidated premises, material shortages, and so on. And Brown managed to settle the AA organizationally, but also financially. And by promoting a proudly outward-looking culture, he positioned the AA, briefly at least, at the center of the international discourse on architectural education. It was Brown's successor, Robert Furneaux Jordan, who reaped the benefits. Jordan's school was dominated by mature ex-service students, packed to the rim, and as a result of that, in a rare state of affluence. Jordan was a man of firm and firmly left-leaning political convictions, and we will see that the AA, in many ways, mirrored the broader political situation under the post-war Labour government. And tellingly, the two ended at the same time in 1951. What followed was the decade-long tenure of Michael Patrick, who had a rather rocky start, shall we say. With the end of government support for ex-service students, the AA faced imminent bankruptcy. There was growing pressure from the RIBA and the Ministry of Education, neither of which had much time for the AA's fiercely independent stance. And last but not least, the students themselves developed a deep dislike for Michael Patrick and tried for years to get him sacked. None of this had any noticeable impact on Patrick himself, who turned out to be a capable and immensely resilient principal. He established the pioneering Department of Tropical Architecture. He reintroduced a modified unit system, and in his second term, he implemented a staffing policy which was as inspired and successful as Boyarsky's 2 decades later. In the early 1960s, following the Oxford Conference and the Robbins Report, things started to look pretty hopeless for independent educational institutions. The AA was dominated by a technocratic elite on the council, which pushed for a merger with Imperial College and appointed as their new principal Bill Allen, who was an internationally renowned building scientist and a major figure within the RIBA. Allen tried to strengthen the intellectual content of the course, but he really didn't have a happy time at the AA. The students turned against him, the studio staff turned against him, and in the end, the council dismissed him in a rather undignified and legally questionable manner. So these, briefly summarized, were the major shifts that took place within the AA. It is tempting to portray the history of the AA as a succession of such shifts and discontinuities. It is tempting because it is broadly true, and it explains some of the vigor and vitality which has been the trademark of the AA over the past 100 years. Less obvious, but equally important to understand the post-war AA are the continuities within its history. And it is these continuities which I would like to discuss today, and specifically the continuities in AA student work. There are, I would argue, three main themes underpinning AA student work in the post-war period: social purpose, eclecticism, and total environment. It should become clear what I mean by these labels once we look at them in more detail. Presumably you are like me and prefer a screen presentation to be about images rather than text. So what I'm going to do today is to give you a run through a small selection of the many wonderful student projects that I've included in my book. I intend to show you 30 slides in 30 minutes, so it's all going to be rather pacey. Now, from a 21st century perspective, there's nothing particularly extraordinary about this idea of architecture, not just as a service to the client, but as a service to society more broadly. It is easily forgotten that in the UK, at least, this understanding of the profession was very much a post-war legacy. It was the result of a campaign to raise the esteem and influence of public sector architects within the RIBA, which pedagogically culminated in the Oxford Conference of 1958. Now, some schools played a major part in these developments, and none more so than the AA. And I think it's worth emphasizing this, not least because the AA struggled to live with the consequences and was soon to actively oppose the new consensus. The AA has always offered its students ample scope for self-expression, sometimes excessively so, and I will return to this a little bit later. But for now, it's important to stress that for much of its history and throughout the post-war period, such excess and extravagance was cushioned by a firm social ethos, which doesn't necessarily conform with the stereotypical view of the AA. The roots of this social ethos lie in the 1930s, and the man who brought it into the AA was E.A.A. Rouse, who joined the school in 1933 and became its principal 2 years later. Rouse promoted an interest in modernist planning, which he saw as an economic, political, and sociological problem as much as an architectural one. The chief accomplishment of his tenure was the so-called town plan of 1938, to which I will return in a different context. At this point here, I want to show an earlier example, a slum clearance scheme for St. Pancras of 1935, which illustrates how quickly Rouse's impact was felt at the AA, not only thematically, but also in the way that architecture was increasingly seen as a collective effort. This is one of the earliest group theses that I'm aware of, not only at the AA, but more widely. Apart from Gordon Brown, who will become the first post-war principal of the AA, the most notable member of this thesis group was Dick Shepherd, the founder director of Shepherd Robson. Shepherd was the one who drew this axonometric drawing, which, as you can see, combines 5-story slabs with these Y-shaped high-rises. And you can see the desired effect in this perspective drawing. The scheme and these Chicken Claw Towers in particular was inspired by Le Corbusier's recent work, and you can see echoes of Tecton's High Point, which was under construction at the time. Now, the conservative members of the AA Council soon militated against Raus's continental modernism and urged him, and I quote, to weed out the sociological tendencies in the school. This was the last thing on his mind, and so he was sacked. His ideas, however, survived, particularly this interest in social surveys as the basis for housing, and indeed the idea of housing as an architectural problem at all. I'm showing you just in passing an interesting example produced towards the end of the war by Philip Powell, Jacob Moyer, and Margaret Taylor, to say that this was the model for Powell and Moyer's Churchill Gardens. It would be a bit of a stretch, not least because the scale was much smaller. But the layout did anticipate some of the key features of their breakthrough project, and particularly this idea of a central corridor cutting through parallel rows of slabs on a trapezoid plot. It was in the post-war years that a firm social agenda came to dominate the work of AA students, reflecting the situation in the country more widely. Attlee's Labour government imposed material licensing and other restrictions on the building industry, and it channeled the country's limited resources into the most pertinent social tasks, particularly schools and housing. With the NHS pointing the way, the possibility of a state-run architectural profession became a real prospect. And AA Principal Fernand Jordan, at any rate, believed very firmly that the future of architectural practice would lie in an all-encompassing public sector. And he purposely adapted the school curriculum to the working methods of progressive architects departments such as the London County Council and Hertfordshire. The slide shows a typical example of this period, a project for a secondary school by Geoffrey Salmon, who later became a partner with Austin Smith Lord. The whole thing had to be based on the modular grid of the Hertfordshire schools, whose architects wrote the brief, advised the students, and supplied all technical information. Salmon himself found it all rather limiting and grim, and so he invited some art students to lighten it up with colourful garden sculptures and decorative panels. For a brief period, Jordan's politics really caught the mood of the time, but eventually in 1951, they cost him his job. And meanwhile, the Tories won the general election, and there were building cuts and worsening employment prospects for architectural graduates. And this all added to a sense of gloom among students. And the icing on the cake was the appointment of the unpopular Michael Patrick as Jordan's successor, which triggered bitter altercations between students and the school authorities. Much of the post-war enthusiasm for a new Jerusalem was lost in these circumstances, but nevertheless, a strong social dimension remained a feature of AA student work, and certainly among the more sensitive students who picked up on this early brutalist thinking on the nature of community and streets, urban sociology, and so forth. The project on this slide here exemplifies this trend. It shows Denise Cook-Brown's thesis, jointly done with Brian Smith, which proposed the extension of an existing village in Wales in the form of stepped low-rise high-density housing. It was one of several theses in that particular year which looked for an architectural solution to stem the decline of the Welsh mining villages, which was hitting the news at that time. In the later years of the decade, social content was often concealed by striking formal features, and I will show you a prime example of this in a moment. But it never really disappeared, and in the early 1960s it came to the fore again. Now, the previous years had seen the Oxford Conference as part of a much broader constitutional revamp of the RIBA aimed to establish architecture as a public service. And there was, not just at the AA, a renewed interest in large-scale public housing after a period of reflection on the mixed results of the first generation new towns. This group of students here offered a vast and highly rationalized scheme for one of the designated housing areas of the LCC's proposed new town at Hook. It relied on a multi-level access deck with apartment blocks feeding a series of pedestrian decks, so-called spine routes, which led to low-rise terraces and local amenities, and then continued across motorway bridges to give access to a number of detached houses overlooking a lake. The perspective drawing here at the top shows one of these spine routes here. There was a succession of similar projects in the following years, each building on the previous ones and continuing a line of investigation into the use of prefabrication and modular building components for large housing developments. And the slide shows two examples by Howden Rich and by Christopher Cross. This series, effectively a housing research program, reflects the research emphasis that was carried into the school by the new principal, Bill Allen, who was convinced of the vital role of science and technology in producing better human environments. Now, Allen's attempts to promote this mindset at the AA were not altogether successful, putting it mildly. They were a bit of a disaster. The one exception was the work of the famous Department of Tropical Studies. The Tropical Department had been established in 1954, but it came fully into its stride towards the end of the decade and in the early 1960s, when it was headed by Otto Königsberger and pioneered what we today call environmental design, so the analysis of a wide range of environmental factors as the basis for architectural design. The much maligned banana sundial diagrams, which we often see on student work these days. The slide shows a typical example by Patrick Wakely, later a professor of urban development at UCL. The table on the left shows Wakely's data collection, looking into various climatic factors for his university college in Tanzania. And equally typical of the period was, as Mark Crinson has highlighted, the fact that regardless of context and local building traditions, the process relied on industrialized technologies and invariably involved an advocacy of modernist forms. Now, this question of architectural form and expression brings me to my second theme in AA student work, namely its eclecticism. This anything goes mentality where students are encouraged to discover and develop their individual aesthetic sensibilities is of course a familiar feature of the AA and a major reason why for many decades the school has been an inexhaustible source of architectural fashion and novelty. The point that I would like to get across today is that this eclecticism is not a recent phenomenon. It is a theme that runs through the post-war period, and in this, the AA differed very sharply from other leading schools, and particularly in an international context. Unlike, for instance, Harvard under Gropius or the IIT under Mies van der Rohe, the AA never nurtured a house style. This was no accident, but deliberate policy. And it was one of the reasons why the AA never appointed a leading designer as the head of its school, with the sole exception of Freddie Gibbard during the war, and he didn't last very long. Now, it took a moment just after the war for students to forget their grim surroundings and imagine an architecture unrestrained by current material shortages. Investigations into prefab systems, such as the secondary school I showed you earlier, injected a sense of realism into student work. And the results were often competent, but they were very rarely exciting. And certainly the period was not the visually most exhilarating in the AA's history. As in British architecture more widely, the Festival of Britain was a welcome catalyst. And for a short period, the festival style, or mid-century modern, as we now call it, was all the rage. And this beautifully drawn sketch here for a festival cafe by Nigel Grimwade exemplifies this trend with this picturesque setting and subtle use of colours. The festival coincided with the arrival of Michael Patrick as the head of the school, and Patrick was explicit in his wish to foster eclecticism in his school, and he chose his staff for the strength of their convictions, whatever these convictions were. And the result was an enormous variety of approaches and formal expressions depending on the students themselves and the tutors with whom they affiliated. Frank Lloyd Wright had visited the AA in the previous year, and he acquired a small but active following, which included most notably Arns Burton and Korolek, and you can see an example of their work on this slide. Much more pervasive was a Miesian influence, which was noticeable from the late 1940s, fell a bit out of fashion over the course of the 1950s, but then experienced a remarkable revival in the early 1960s when several AA tutors returned from stints in major American practices such as Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill. This slide here shows an early example of this Miesian type, and a particularly interesting one. This is a shop for stories in Kensington. The building featured a glazed lift, which is about 3 decades ahead of its time, but sadly isn't visible on this image. It was on the rear side. What you can see on this image is the change in fenestration patterns, which was a charming attempt to counter the monotony of curtain wall elevations. Equally charming, I think, is the fact that the students spent endless hours building this wonderful model, but still never noticed the typo on the shop sign. It's the kind of thing that leaves you completely puzzled as a design tutor. Of the various influences that manifested themselves in student work in the early 1950s, Le Corbusier's was by far the most dominant. The Unité d'Habitation became the destination of many a pilgrimage. More remarkable was the rediscovery of Corp's pre-war work by a group of students which included John Miller, Neve Brown, David Gray, and Kenneth Frampton. Their tutors belonged to the festival generation, which means they were about 10 years older, but seemingly of a different era. And they found the students' interest in early modernism retrogressive. In reality, the students were, of course, ahead of the curve, as the reappraisal of 1920s and 1930s precedents fed directly into the early brutalist discourse. Notice the grid of Piloty, the horizontal windows and the sheltered roof terrace, all derived from the Villa Stein and Villa Savoie. In the second half of the 1950s, the school came to be dominated by John Killick and Peter Smithson, who took charge of the senior years. Now, regardless of their previous affiliations and inclinations, at the end of their course, all AA students came under the direction or guidance of first Killick and then Smithson. Unsurprisingly, much of their work can be loosely summarized under the term brutalism. Now, the brutalist canon, of course, remains a matter of considerable debate. Bannon himself, as you know, never really got his head around it. I won't go into this today, but I think we can all agree that this one here definitely fits the bill with its rugged skyline and confident use of exposed concrete. Plans and sections were inspired by the Unité, and you can see the overlapping maisonette dwellings very clearly articulated on the exterior. Now, this was a social housing scheme for Paddington, which was designed to comply with LCC densities, as well as LCC cost frames, and hence the choice of a precast concrete panel system. Killick always linked his studio briefs to current LCC problems and current LCC sites. And as a consequence, not only were the results realistic and of broader relevance, they also sustained a strong social agenda behind all the formal bravado. The Paddington Scheme is my all-time favorite AA project, in part, I suppose, because I'm a sucker for beautiful drawings, and these ones here, almost unrivaled, even in a very crowded AA field. These drawings were widely published and exhibited at the time. My pet theory is that some of the younger students were so dazzled by the sheer beauty of this pipework and this service machinery that they couldn't help themselves envisaging an entire building like this, and that this was the real origin of archigram. Killick and Smithson encouraged their students to broaden their source material and look into a wider range of precedents, specifically what John Outram called the major-minor figures of modernism. As a result, the school witnessed a remarkable outburst of originality and formal experiment, much of it inspired by the Russian constructivists, as was the case with the Paddington Scheme, or the German expressionists, as in this case here. This is a fourth-year project for a concert hall, one of the seminal AA student projects, designed by the uniquely gifted Edward Reynolds, who died while still a student at the AA. The plan here was for a fan-shaped auditorium with a series of lateral stair towers, which generated this faceted envelope. The following years saw a succession of similarly exciting projects at the AA, and you won't be surprised to find a fair few of them in my book. Things did eventually calm down in the early 1960s, and this year is in a way the last of the outrageously exuberant projects of the period, Martin Pauli's design for a film theatre. Peter Cook loved it, and you can see why. A cinema consisting of 700 bubble-shaped viewing cubicles supported and serviced by a megastructural platform. What's not to like? Quite a bit, as it turned out. This project was either half a decade behind or ahead of its time, but in any event, it didn't go down well with the AA in the early 1960s. Those who had nurtured the excesses of the late 1950s, Smithson, Killick, and Patrick, had all meanwhile left the AA, and with Bill Allen, a new wind blew through the AA, a white heat wave of technology, if you like. Incidentally, Pauli himself left the AA. He returned 5 years later to complete his thesis, which was promptly failed again. He then hooked up with Robin Middleton at the AD, got it published there, and in doing so managed to get the school to reverse its original decision. It's about as typical an AA tale as you can get. Much more successful at the time was the cool rationality of the so-called grunt group around Michael Gold, Jeremy and Fenella Dixon and Edward Jones. And this thesis is a prime example of their ability to resolve even the most complex programs into a very clear conceptual solution. This project was for a residential teaching college, and the students divided the program into two distinct parts, one a binuclear teaching block and the other a slab for student and staff accommodation running up the slope. The main access level of the teaching block was on the second floor, which connects via this pedestrian bridge to the circulation tower of the residential slab. I am discussing the later years of the decade in my book, but will largely exclude them from my talk today, not least because it was such a visually rich period that it would be difficult to do it justice. Of course, this was a time of great liberalism, not just at the AA, but in society more widely. Through Cedric Price and archigram, kind of proto-hippie mood pervaded the AA in the mid-1960s. Architecture could be anything. Any attempt to define its scope and nature smacked of conservative authoritarianism, and so it wasn't even tried. Some students continued to design houses in the traditional sense, but most didn't. And I'm showing you just in passing this project here by Jeremy Brown, in part because of its wonderful flower power graphics, but also because it exemplifies this retreat of the architectural designer. The idea here was that of an urban experiment on the basis of a serviced lattice work. Brown offered one possible way in which this framework could be filled with functions, but he was entirely uncommitted to this. Occupants were free to do with it as they pleased. If they wanted to destroy it or simply ignore it, then that was just as well. Brown's project, which was very highly rated at the time, links up quite nicely with the final of my three themes today, which I would term the quest for the total environment. Now, total environment was a phrase coined by Bobby Carter, the director of the AA in the early 1960s. It encapsulated the idea that the architect's responsibility was not just for the design of buildings, but for the physical environment as a whole. From the spoon to the city, as Fernor Jordan once put it. Incidentally, Jordan himself had borrowed that phrase from Ernesto Rogers, Richard's cousin and a major figure in Italian post-war architecture, whom he persuaded to teach at the AA for a short time. Anyway, it's a classically modernist notion originating in the interwar years, and one cannot give a talk about the AA without mentioning, at least in passing, the famous town plan of 1938, a collaborative scheme produced by no fewer than 15 thesis students working together. Now, earlier I mentioned this collective spirit which infused the AA in the late 1930s. Students engaged with resident associations. They carried out social surveys. They investigated prefabrication and modern servicing technologies, all in support of a proudly stated social agenda. Gone were the mansions for suburbanite bankers or the proverbial admiral's house on a rocky promontory. Such exercises have survived at many other schools, but at the AA, students tackled nurseries, health centres, slum clearance projects, and so on. The town plan, which you can see on the screen, was the culminating achievement of this period. An entire town consisting of 5 neighbourhood units, you can see one of them on the left here, located around a town centre and separated by a green belt from the surrounding industrial areas. Now, what is remarkable is the sheer ambition and scope of it, extending the view from a small housing estate to an entire town. The project anticipated the new town planning program. And when this program became a reality after the war, it triggered a series of similarly ambitious schemes by a new generation of AA students. Two projects set the tone in the immediate post-war years. The first one was this one here, which focused on Ping Green, one of the neighbourhoods of Stevenage Newtown. The students proposed a mixture of single-storey houses and point blocks, and on the right-hand side you can see one of these point blocks, the so-called big towers, which were designed by Bill Howell and John Killick as a very early adaptation of the Unité d'Habitation, which was going up in Marseille at the time. The second thesis project was submitted 2 years later by Andrew Derbyshire, John Volker, and Pat Crook. And this was the famous zone thesis, which proposed a network of self-sufficient farming communities supporting a central urban core, which was itself subdivided into neighborhoods, districts, streets, and ultimately doorsteps of 30 people each. The students chose a site in Hertfordshire, not far from Stevenage, for their case study, but they saw it as a model for the reorganization of the country as a whole. AA students' concern with the total environment often left the design of actual buildings as a bit of a side concern. The RIBA witnessed this development with great skepticism and pressured the new AA principal, Michael Patrick, to stop students veering too far from architecture in its traditional sense. Fearful of losing RIBA validation, Patrick tried to limit the student scope, particularly in the lower years, which made him even more unpopular than he already was. Yet his change of policy had little effect on thesis students, and certainly in the early 1950s, there was a whole succession of schemes in the tradition of the much admired and very highly rated Ping Green and Zone thesis projects. The Nice-Cope-Brown's thesis, which I showed you earlier, fits into this category. And this here is another one, Daemonia, a new town for 120,000 people in southwest England, organized symmetrically on a cross-shaped plan, a very unusual Beaux-Arts gesture at the time, certainly at the AA. Rather more cutting edge was this project, the most daring of the lot. The slide shows a monumental unit town, which was the basic unit of a much larger urban scheme, the so-called life structure. The student, Ronald Jones, suggested that after a century of population growth, 4 such unit towns might converge into a unit city, and that several such unit cities will then in turn form a unit metropolis of 2 million people each, all of it linked by travelators and powered by thermal wells. Now, I have spoken quite a bit already about the late 1950s, so let me jump straight into the early 1960s, which were, of course, the heyday of the architect planner and the idea of the total environment. The various housing theses, which I showed you earlier, sit in this context, but the prime example is this one here, Euroway, which dwarfs even the most extraordinary projects of the early 1950s. The context for this project was Britain's anticipated accession to the European Common Market, so very timely. And the students tried to give this physical form by connecting 7 main entry ports into the country with major conurbations and industrial sites via a vast megastructural network. The image on the right shows one of these entry ports, a bridge across the English Channel, and the diagrams at the top show the basic network and zoning of Euroway, which consisted of highly urbanized land reservation strands lined with numerous so-called urban units, which you can see below. Now, the whole scheme was worked out in great detail, and the slide here shows one of these urban units, each housing 500,000 residents and meant to halt urban sprawl in London and the Midlands. It is the most ambitious project of this period, which incidentally also saw the establishment of a flourishing postgraduate planning department at the AA. This department would later make a stand against Alvin Boyarsky and, like everyone else who stood in his way, would not survive the encounter. That's a different story, though. I mentioned earlier the presence of Cedric Price, an archigram, who in the mid-1960s left a profound impact on the AA. Their thinking into impermanence and obsolescence was echoed in a number of thesis projects, which were no less ambitious in scope than those of the early 1960s, but where the emphasis was on the organization of systems and networks and motion patterns, rather than the way in which these were then shaped into architectural form. The most interesting and intriguing example was perhaps this one here, Nicholas Grimshaw's urban university, which was to cover a wholly raised Covent Garden area. The plan diagram, which you see on the left, coordinates a 60-degree movement grid with a 90-degree spatial grid on the levels above and below by means of service and circulation towers placed at the nodal points. And the cardboard model on the right shows one of these nodal points which were connected, again, via travelator, the running theme in the 1960s. The entire scheme was geared to change and adaptation, and Grimshaw himself prepared a little film, which he showed as part of his thesis presentation and which has miraculously survived in the AA archive. For obvious reasons, I couldn't include this in my book, and I'd always hoped for an opportunity to broadcast it, and here it is. The clip illustrates how faculties, remember it's a university, how faculties could expand and perish over time. So the building as a permanently mutating organism, if you like. I'm conscious of time, so I'll play this at 8 times the original speed. It's really rather mesmerizing. Take a look. So red indicates areas of most intensity and yellow of least intensity. And notice how different nodes grow in importance, form links with each other, and then change again or die out. And the same applies to the travelators, which change in size according to the importance of the nodes that they connect. Peter Cook was enthusiastic about this project, which in his view, and I quote, marked a first staging post in the process of disintegrating a tradition, that of designing a building as the prerequisite of making architecture, unquote. Indeed, the idea that architecture could be more, or at any rate something other than merely designing a building, would become a major theme in the following years and decades. Unlike my book, which continues this discussion into the 1970s and beyond, my talk needs to end somewhere, and I think Grimshaw's project seems the appropriate point to do so. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for that, Patrick. That's amazing, absolutely fascinating, and some incredible images there, some I've never seen before. And just the use of post-it notes there by Nick Grimshaw, just as you say, mesmerizing. I'm going to be quite brief because my neighbour has decided to have a piano practice, so might get a bit noisy. But I'd like to open the field to questions for Patrick, if I may. I don't know how we're going to work this. If people want to,
so there's two ways you can ask a question. You can either use the raise hand function, which should either be if you click on participants at the bottom of your screen, or if you have the new version of Zoom, it'll be under reactions. It just says raise hand. And then we can unmute you. Or if you can't find it, just type your question in the chat, or just let me know in the chat that you want to ask a question and I'll unmute you.
Perhaps if I could start things off while people gather their thoughts. Certainly listening to you tonight, Patrick, but also reading your book, it's very striking how successful the AA is, but how unlikely, in such unlikely circumstances. I mean, your narrative is one of financial crisis after financial crisis, its independence being constantly threatened, continual bickering, and conflict between students and chair and council and students. And I wonder if this in a way is one of the kind of structural parts of the AA makeup, which actually encourages kind of a chaos that brings about, what should we say, a constant refreshing, a constant sense of pressing forward. You don't get this long-term continuity that you might elsewhere with a kind of a more conventional structure. I just wondered maybe if you could talk to us a little bit regarding that.
Yeah, I totally agree with this. The AA really thrives on I wouldn't say chaos, but living on the edge, which it really did or has done throughout its history, and certainly in the post-war period, even before that. I mean, basically the AA, or certainly the school, was always broke. So it was kind of subsidized by the association, which itself had no money, and I was personally surprised when I did the research on the AA, how close it came regularly to closing its doors, but also the kind of, I wouldn't say nonchalance, but a slight naivety with which they just kind of modeled on. And I think part of this has to do with the fact, part of both the problems but also the success of the AA is due to the fact that it's a school completely run by architects. So even high-level negotiations or bookkeeping is all done by architect volunteers. So, a certain chaos you kind of would expect. But on the other hand, there was also a really sort of a strong sense of purpose in what they always did. They really wanted to run this school, no matter what, and as long as they could. And through this spirit, they made it through some very hairy situations. Because the situation was difficult, often it caused argument and it caused controversy. And out of this controversy often grew new initiatives. And I think the Department of Tropical Architecture, for instance, as the unit system, the modified unit system, which Patrick brought back, both these things happened in the same week in 1954, which was basically in a week in which the AA Council discussed whether they should close the AA because the situation was hopeless. And those in charge then, even though the situation is hopeless, we may as well start something new. It's quite amazing. I never really got my head around it, but it's fascinating, and it really is one of the major reasons for its success, but also for its lack of success financially. But for its, the creativity and vitality that comes out of the AA is really something. And I think those who argued very strongly in the 1960s against the merger with Imperial College, I think certainly from a historian's point of view, they had a very valid point in defending the AA's independence no matter what. So I think it really is the secret of the AA's success. Its independence and the fact that it's run by architects, for architects.
Thank you. We've had a couple of questions in the comments field. First of all, there's a question from Peter Wilde, and he's asking for some more information, really, for more detail on the unit system and when it was first introduced. And I believe it predates Alvin.
Yes, very complicated and complex and long story. So the original unit system was introduced by Rouse in the 1930s, and it was a very different beast to the unit system that came later. It was based on basically 15 term-based units. So each term was a separate unit, and each student would enter the first term in the first unit and then progress via 15 units to the final thesis. And it had several advantages. First of all, it built smaller units, and therefore each unit could develop its own identity, similarly to what came later. But it also had problems. And one of the major problems was that you can't really organize lecture courses on a term basis, or you can't start a lecture course 3 times a year, so with each new term. And so there was always a conflict between what was welcome in the studio, but what really didn't work with lecture courses. So you had students ending up taking lectures for something that should have been covered a long time ago in the studio and the other way. So it was chaos, and it didn't really work. So they got rid of it after the Second World War, not least because the numbers were such that it just wasn't operable. With 500 students, you can't run a unit system. But it was very popular, especially with the old AA people who became tutors immediately after the war. And Michael Patrick brought it back in 1954 in a modified form. I won't go into too much detail on this, but the interesting thing about this is it was it was a compromise solution, but he was very keen on using the terminology of the unit system because it had such a value in AA circles. And that continued basically up until the mid-1960s when John Lloyd basically introduced a system very similar to the one that Boyarsky later used. There were some differences, but he kind of pioneered the system, which then Alvin Boyarsky really put at the core of his pedagogical approach. I think the main difference, just to briefly summarize, the main difference between Boyarsky's system and the preceding unit system was the idea of competition. So Boyarsky set it up very deliberately as a competitive system where units competed with each other. And that was not the case in the earlier iterations, where it was, this idea of units kind of working against it, not working against each other, but kind of, competing with each other. That didn't exist. That was very much Boyarsky's invention. And it's just finally, sorry to keep waffling on, but it's very interesting that the unit system, of course, is one of these real inventions of the AA, which really has spread globally and at least in a modified forms, exists pretty much everywhere. I studied at ETH, and it couldn't be further, ideologically further away from the AA, but we had a unit system, so no one would have admitted where it came from. But very interesting topic.
Great. So a second question from Sylvia Border. It's about exchanges. Can you discuss or mention what type of exchanges were happening at the AA during the period spoken within the UK? In particular, was there an exchange, conferences, student study periods, etc., with the North, with Glasgow or elsewhere? My interests lie in the idea of ripple effects or other exchanges that might not be easily recognised in terms of secondary dissemination.
Certainly not before the Oxford Conference, neither between the AA and Northern School, nor between the AA and other schools, nor indeed between any schools, because there was no codified and standardized educational model. So the idea that you that you learn something in one school, which you can then easily transfer to another school, is very much a legacy of the Oxford Conference, and only came in 1963. So the Bartlett, Cambridge and Durham were the first three schools which acknowledged each other's first degrees. And before that, there was no way of exchanging students, because, and certainly the AA would not have accepted it, because the AA thought it educated its students to a standard which could not be met anywhere else. And to some extent, they were right about this. And so the AA became a magnet for students wanting to finish their course somewhere really good. So, Cambridge students, once they had their intermediate course finished, they applied in great numbers to the AA, and same with the Royal West of England Academy in Bristol. But really, it applies to all schools, and quite a few of the most famous people graduating from the AA had started their course somewhere else. I'm not familiar with a single case where an AA students went somewhere else to study. They were all quite convinced that they were in the right place. So it was very sought after course, very difficult to get into, and I am not aware of any students going anywhere else once they were at the AA.
Okay, so a question from John here. Thank you very much for your wonderful presentation. As the AA has been internationally well known, have you encountered any student work from Asia, especially from Hong Kong, back in the 1950s to 60s. I believe they had brought tropical architecture back to the Asia regions and especially influenced a lot of Hong Kong, Singapore.
There were a good number, I wouldn't say many, but there was a good number of Asian students, including from Hong Kong and Singapore at the AA. Was it John who asked that question? Happy to, if you want to contact me via email, I can share with you what I have on this. One interesting character, a little bit beside the point, was a man called Stanley Kwok, who graduated from the AA and apparently became one of the major real estate developers, first in Hong Kong and later in Vancouver. He's still alive. Apparently he's a billionaire. And so he was an AA graduate. So he came from Hong Kong, studied at the AA, and then returned. But there are many others. And there is, in my opinion, more interesting connection with Hong Kong through Gordon Brown, who I mentioned was the first AA principal and a very, very fascinating character. And Gordon Brown, he left the AA very suddenly, apparently because he got into some financial trouble. And he went to Edinburgh for a year or two, but didn't really work well either there. And then he went to Hong Kong, and he basically built up the School of Hong Kong on the model of the AA. And it was very highly praised at the time, including by James Richards, who went to inspect it for the Colonial Office in terms of, to see whether they still deserved their funding. And Gordon Brown he built a lot in Hong Kong, and it's a kind of sort of research angle that I would very much like to explore further, because he played a much bigger part in Hong Kong than at the AA, where no one remembers him, and very unfairly so.
The next question from Nirma Kridge. Thank you for a great presentation, Patrick. I really look forward to reading your book. I have a couple of questions. One is to do with the physical size of the archive and the number of student drawings. How many did you look through? And how many were finally selected for publication in your book? Are there any drawings by female students of note? The second question, excuse me, I'm just going down here. The second question is to do with the AA's physical buildings interiors throughout this time. Is there something particularly different during this time in the way the buildings were used and changed?
As to the first question, I mean, Ed would be more qualified to answer, but the AA archive is an absolutely unique repository of student work, which probably certainly unmatched in Britain, probably in Europe. I hope I saw everything, but it's well possible that I didn't, because it's just such a huge and fast-growing collections. But I did try to see everything there is to say. In the end, I included just over 100 drawings, not all of them from the AA archives, but the vast majority of them. This includes my personal favorite in the book, which is Denise Cope-Brown's Thesis, which is not held by the AA, unfortunately. But the AA archive holds other student work of quite a few women students. So if you're personally looking into this topic, I think the AA is a real treasure trove. It includes, for instance, Inette Austin-Smith, who was the wife of Michael Austin-Smith, and they founded Austin-Smith Law together. But there are many others. I remember them. Gillian Hopwood certainly is a particularly good example. There are loads of others. As to the way the buildings were used, I've got to be honest, even though I visit the AA quite often, I am not entirely sure how the building is actually used now, because I know that the student numbers that the AA have do not fit into the spaces that you have. And I'm aware that they kind of drop in for tutorials and all that, but I'm not entirely sure how it works. But what I do know is that it worked completely different in the post-war period when, there was no such thing as remote learning or teaching or working. So people were there. The AA acquired additional premises on a short-term basis around Bedford Square. And then obviously in the mid-1950s, Michael Patrick built the roof extension, which I believe is still used as a studio now. But yeah, basically it was really packed and certainly benefited a lot from this. I think that the smallness of the AA, the Bedford Square premises, and the kind of the tightness and the fact that you really rub shoulders, not just with fellow students, but with world famous architects, and the kind of the intimacy that the premises give the school, I think, is a real feature, and always has been. I think that the AA really. It used to be in different premises before the First World War, and it's generally accepted that the move to Bedford Square was what made the difference to the AA. When the AA was in discussion on a merger with Imperial College, there was a suggestion to move to new premises in Kensington, and apart from the very question of independence, this relocation was one of the real bones of contention, because people did not want to move Bedford Square, and rightly so.
Thank you. Another question from Hamida Ibrahim. Thanks for the amazing presentation. I'd ask the same question as John, but would you encounter works from the Middle East? And do you agree that Dubai's latest architectural practice is an extension of the concepts discussed in the presentation?
Not quite sure. But in terms of Middle Eastern students in the post-war period, they must have been there because there just were so many students, and they were from everywhere. But you have to bear in mind that at its highest under Fernand Jordan, school had 540 students, which you can't really. I have a fairly complete spreadsheet, I think. So I could go through them if you're looking for someone in particular, but nationalities were rarely given, except for the Department of Tropical Studies, where there were a lot of students, including from the Middle East. Quite a fair number. But I can't really, my assumption would be yes, there would have been certainly students from the Middle East, but I can't remember anyone in particular in the normal course, but certainly in the Department of Tropical Studies.
There you go. You need to come and do some research yourself in the archive.
Can't hear you, Ed.
There's a question from Natcha. She's got her hand up. I don't know if we can unmute.
I've asked her to unmute.
There we go. Can you?
Yes, hi.
Is that you?
Hi, Patrick. Thank you so much for such a fascinating presentation. I have a questions about, so you mentioned how students transfer and they want to finish their architecture degree with at the AA. So I have a questions about, I'm aware that many people from Cambridge, because at the time Cambridge was not recognized until like 1960 or later. So they would start their degree at Cambridge and then they would transfer to the AA and the Bartlett. And I wonder if you come across some sort of like evaluations or some student feedback that kind of like describe what this transition was and how they find the AA compared to Cambridge and elsewhere?
Yeah, quite a bit. Sent me an email and I
okay.
what I have with you. I mean, the interesting thing is that Cullinan came from Cambridge. Bill Howell came from Cambridge. Cedric Price. So there were quite a few, prominent people, and there are oral history interviews with these people, and they often comment on the changeover to the AA. One interesting feature is that Michael Patrick organized a summer course for arriving Cambridge students, and basically that summer course would bring Cambridge students onto the level of AA students after the third year. Because without that course, the assumption or experience was that they were nowhere near as good as AA students after 3 years. And so they had to enter second year. And to avoid this, Patrick organized a course that was free for Cambridge students, but they had to attend it over the summer to kind of catch up with what the AA kind of expected of their students. Now, students obviously hated this. And the funny thing is, the AA, when it ran into financial difficulties, it sought affiliation with various other institutions. Amongst them was a proposal to merge with Cambridge. And Cambridge rejected that offer after quite a long discussion. And the AA, and Michael Patrick in particular, was personally affronted by that because he thought he'd done so much for Cambridge by organizing these free courses for their students. The fact that they wouldn't kind of reciprocate and kind of show a bit more goodwill to the AA didn't go down well. But yeah, the connection was very close between Cambridge and the AA, and there is a fair amount of material on this.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Ed, you're on mute.
I think we've got a couple more questions here, which I'll take as the last. So as we're running a little bit out of time here. So the first one is from Takako, and she says, "Thank you for the fascinating lecture. I wonder how the teaching was like on a day-to-day basis with the juries as we have now, and how were the group projects assessed? Do you know what were the facilities like, such as workshops, etc.? Did they have parties, etc., as student life?" So quite a lot of questions there, Takako. But if you could maybe try and ask them.
Yes to everyone. They definitely had an active social life. They also had juries, and very similar to juries nowadays. I mean, pretty much, pioneered this. And it pioneered it long before. So yeah, juries were very much a sort of key teaching method. As to how group work was assessed, it was assessed as a group. So no individual contributions were it was not distinguished between, so the student as a group, the group as a whole was judged, which led to some problems with the RIBA, because as they are now, each individual student must prove its worth. And because at the AA, and specifically under Jordan, everything was group work, that really led to massive controversies with the RIBA, including a threat to stop a validation of the school, with which Fernand Jordan would have been quite happy. Probably not had he thought about it a little bit longer, but the general feeling was that the RIBA was holding the AA back, because Jordan believed so much in the idea of the public sector and architects department and collective working, the whole course was based on group work, and he thought that was the future and what the RIBA expected in terms of individual performances was just old hat. Workshops, yes, from pretty much from the end of the war. Immediately after the war, they even had a practical training site on Morwell Street, which is quite an achievement given that building materials were quite hard to come by. So yeah, they had a very strong kind of practical dimension in their work throughout the post-war period. And going back to the kind of the pure academic system that then came in following the Oxford Conference never really aligned very well with the AS tradition, which was much more arts and craftsy in its core.
And the parties?
I wasn't there, but I saw earlier Simon Pepper on a list of invitees, and he would remember the parties at the AA. Yeah, I mean, the word is that it was as socially active as it is now. Oh, there's someone who knows. But yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, parties were manic. There was a thing called the Carnival, which came just before Christmas, organized usually by the second year, and everybody just went crazy and did up every other room in different styles. There were themes, think pink, and there was a Wild West one, and there was a Prohibition one, which was really great. And there were limits on numbers. You were supposed to only have some 500 people in the AA, and always twice as many tickets were sold. It was my only experience of seeing a stripper in my entire life. And it was pretty crazy stuff. It was exciting, and everybody got very heavily into it around Christmas. It was a sort of big, wild times for students and staff. Yeah. I think you should note the AA had been a kind of public schoolboy place, and then a more universal grant was available from local authorities to go to the AA, and so it changed its demographic quite radically over the period you're talking about, so that people from different backgrounds could come, and it was whereas Cambridge was still Cambridge, but the AA had a very, very broad range. And then, of course, when the independence came, Alvin had to go out and get foreign students from all over the world who had money, because the reason the AA had to fight to be independent was because it lost its tertiary education stature, and the government would no longer pay fees or maintenance. And that had a profound effect on the nature of the student body. And that's what made the AA become an international school, having been a very British school up till then.
Absolutely right, yes.
We have to make this a bigger event later in the year, or when the pandemic's over. We have to really get the round table going. One last question that we had in the chat here. Lost it now. Yes, it's from Jean Matte, and the question is: from the mid-1970s, I went to the AA theory lectures in Percy Street, open to the public. What part did theory play historically in the AA?
Over the post-war period, none, I would say, quite generously. No, I mean, there was a good number of good historians, but architectural theory, in the sense that we understand it today, it did not exist at the AA at the time. It barely existed elsewhere.
Okay, I think that concludes our questions. We're running out of time really tonight. I could personally stay here another 2 hours, but I'm sure people have things to do. So Yeah, thank you all for coming, and thank you most of all, Patrick, of course, for what was it, incredibly entertaining.
Pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, and I just can't recommend this book enough. Please go out and buy it.
Yeah, please do.
Yeah. Yeah. I think the link to the discount is in the chat. So yeah, right at the bottom of the chat there. It's just gone, so you can buy it through that. So thank you very much, everybody, and we'll see you next time.